A fact that should stop you cold. The Igbo are the most commercially active ethnic group in Nigeria. Not the richest by oil revenue, not the most politically connected, but the most economically present in every state, every market, every city, every local government area in this country. You will find an Igbo trader in Maiduguri. You will find an Igbo manufacturer in Kano. You will find an Igbo logistics operator in Sokoto. They have built businesses and livelihoods in places where they cannot legally own permanent land. They have created wealth in environments that were at various points openly hostile to them. And in 64 years of Nigerian independence, not one Igbo person has held the presidency. Not one. Not even close. While the national conversation obsesses over exchange rates and fuel prices, nobody is asking the more precise question. How does a group with this level of economic reach remain this completely locked out of the apex of political power? And who specifically benefits from keeping that gap permanently open? The easy answer is the Civil War. Biafra, 1967, the trauma, the distrust. That answer gets repeated so often it has become a way of stopping thought rather than starting it. Because the real architecture of Igbo political exclusion was not built in 1967. It was rebuilt quietly, institutionally, deliberately in 1999. And it is still fully operational today. So here is the question this analysis will answer and will not let go of until it is fully resolved. Is Igbo political exclusion a wound from the past, or is it a managed policy of the present? Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let's establish exactly what we are looking at and why this moment demands the analysis. Every election cycle since Nigeria's return to democracy in 1999, Igbo political leaders and Ohaneze Ndigbo raise the same demand: Igbo presidency. It is discussed at summits, announced at press conferences, negotiated in backrooms. And every cycle it fails. Not narrowly, it fails completely. The 2023 election was the most dramatic version of this story yet. The Labour Party wave was not a regional phenomenon, it was national. Young Nigerians in Lagos, Abuja, Kaduna, Port Harcourt, Enugu, they mobilized in numbers that had not been seen since the early democracy era. Obi held rallies that filled venues in northern states. He won declared results in multiple units across Lagos. He won the Federal Capital Territory, the seat of federal power itself. The coalition was real, the energy was real, and the official result placed him third. Now, the surface narrative that the political establishment pushed after that result was straightforward. Labour Party was too new, the structure wasn't there, no governors, no senators, no local government machinery. You cannot win a Nigerian presidential election on enthusiasm alone. That narrative is not entirely wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. What the 2023 result actually exposed was not just a structural gap in party organization. It exposed something about how declared votes and observed votes can diverge, and in which specific states and zones that divergence tends to cluster. Field reports, parallel civic tallies, and independent observers documented a pattern that the official result did not reflect. Whether those discrepancies ever receive a full accounting is a separate question, but here is what matters analytically. Even setting aside every disputed figure, the coalition Obi built was sufficient to demonstrate genuine cross-regional viability, and it still wasn't enough to produce a declared victory. That is the result that changed the terms of this conversation permanently. To understand why, you need to go back farther than 2023. Farther even than 1999, you need to understand what the post-Civil War settlement actually looked like on the ground. When the war ended in January 1970, General Gowon declared, "No victor, no vanquished." It was a generous phrase. What followed it was less generous. Igbo who held accounts in Nigerian banks before the war were issued £20 regardless of their pre-war balance. Properties abandoned or seized during the conflict were not returned. Many were declared abandoned and taken over under laws that were selectively enforced. The reconstruction program for the Southeast that was promised never materialized at the scale applied to other post-conflict regions. What the Igbo did in response is one of the most remarkable economic stories in African history. They rebuilt from 20 pounds, from ruins, from scratch, through trade, through hustle, through the kind of commercial ingenuity that now has them embedded in the economies of every single state in this federation. They did not wait for federal patronage. They created their own. But here is what that history reveals about where we are today. The economic reintegration of the Igbo into Nigeria after the Civil War was achieved almost entirely through Igbo self-reliance. The political reintegration was managed on terms set by others. And the terms included an informal but durable understanding that the Southeast would participate in Nigerian democracy as a constituency to be managed, not as a power to be shared. The 1999 transition makes this concrete. When Nigeria's military-era elite negotiated the return to civilian rule, there was a deliberate arrangement made, and it was not written into any law, but it was politically binding. Power would move south. It would go to the southwest. Olusegun Obasanjo, a Yoruba man, a former military head of state with northern establishment endorsement, would be the vehicle. The Southeast was not a primary party to that negotiation. The democratic transition that ended military rule locked in a power geometry that the Igbo did not design and were not consulted to build. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the documented political history of how Nigeria's Fourth Republic began.
Let's go deeper into the institutions that make this exclusion operational, because this is where the real mechanics live. Nigeria's constitution does not bar any citizen from running for president. There's no ethnic clause, no regional restriction, no formal exclusion written into the law. Every Nigerian who meets the age and qualification requirements is constitutionally eligible. This is important, not because it makes the exclusion less real, but because it tells us precisely what kind of exclusion this is. It is not constitutional. It is institutional and political. And that distinction matters, because what is constitutional can be challenged in court. What is institutional and political can be denied, deflected, and quietly maintained indefinitely. Take the federal character principle. Section 14.3 of the Constitution was designed to ensure equitable distribution of appointments and offices across Nigeria's diversity. In practice, it is applied by whoever controls the federal executive, which means it protects the existing distribution. It does not create a new one. A consistent multi-administration pattern of the Southeast receiving fewer federal appointments per capita than any other geopolitical zone is not a violation of federal character as it is currently enforced. It is federal character as it is currently enforced. The principle that was supposed to guarantee inclusion has become a tool for legitimizing the status quo. But the more powerful mechanism is the one hiding in plain sight inside the party structures. Presidential primaries in both the APC and the PDP are won through delegate accumulation. The delegates are governors, senators, state party chairmen, and their networks. The Southeast has 5 states. The Northwest alone has 7. The North collectively spans 19 states across 3 zones. The Southwest has 6. In any primary where delegates vote collegially, which is every primary, a Southeast candidate starts at a structural arithmetic disadvantage before a single vote is cast. You can have the best candidate, the clearest vision, the strongest national appeal. The delegate math does not care. It reflects the existing distribution of political real estate, and the existing distribution was not built to favor the Southeast. This has happened before, but in reverse. When the northern political establishment felt that executive power had been concentrated in southern military hands for too long, the political elite of the late 1990s did something deliberate. They organized, they negotiated, they reached a compact, and they delivered the presidency south, through a specific party with specific guarantees. It worked. It demonstrated that when sufficient political will exists, the system can be directed to produce a specific outcome. The question this raises, the question that doesn't have a comfortable answer, is why that same organized political will has never consolidated around the Southeast. Not once, in 64 years. What exists on paper says any Nigerian can be president. What exists in practice is a delegate architecture, a party structure, and a pattern of electoral results in the Southeast that consistently diverge from what civic observers document on the ground. The gap between what the Constitution promises and what actually happens in Southeast polling units is not random. It follows a pattern, and patterns have authors. Let's now go to the strategic layer, because this is where the real interests live, and they are not all where people expect to find them. Ask who benefits from keeping the Igbo out of the presidency, and most people immediately point north. That is partially correct. Northern political blocs that currently control key federal appointment pipelines, the security services, the major procurement agencies, the upstream petroleum administration, would face genuine renegotiation of those pipelines under a Southeast presidency. A president from Enugu or Imo or Anambra would not owe the existing northern patronage networks the political debts that previous presidents have carried. That is a real threat to real interests, and it is correctly identified. But stop there, and you miss the more uncomfortable half of the story. Some of the most consistent structural obstacles to Igbo presidential ambition have come from within the political elite of the Southeast itself.
Think about that, because it is not irrational. A governor in Anambra or Imo, who has built his relevance by being the broker between his constituency and whoever holds federal power, has a specific kind of political capital. Access capital. He can walk into Aso Rock. He can get the minister's number returned. He can deliver federal projects to his state. That capital exists precisely because he is managing, on behalf of the federal center, a constituency that needs to be kept politically marginal enough to remain dependent on that brokerage. The day an Igbo person becomes president, the value of that brokerage collapses. There is no longer a gap to broker across. The intermediary becomes irrelevant. This is not a theoretical dynamic. It has a historical pattern in how Southeast governors have positioned themselves in every presidential cycle, almost never as unified backers of an Igbo candidate from the start, almost always as late endorsers of whoever is already winning. That positioning is strategic. It is the positioning of people who have learned over decades how to survive in a system that was not built for them, and who have made peace with that survival at the cost of collective advancement. Now, let's follow the money, but precisely, not generically. This is not a story with a single corrupt transaction at its center. The financial dimension is structural, not transactional. The Igbo economic model is mercantile, trade, manufacturing, services. It is dispersed across 36 states and operates largely outside the formal patronage economy that drives federal Nigerian politics. You cannot capture a market network the way you can capture an oil block. You cannot appoint the chairman of Alaba International Market the way you can appoint the group managing director of NNPCL. Federal patronage politics is built around controlling fixed, identifiable resources, and the Igbo economic base largely escapes that architecture. This is the connection that almost no analyst makes. The same economic dispersal that makes Igbo commercial power resilient is precisely what makes Igbo political power fragile. When your people are running businesses in 36 states, in markets and cities that depend on maintaining stable relationships with whoever holds federal and state power in those states, you cannot be a political enemy of the federal center. The threat, implicit, never stated, is always available. Businesses can be disrupted, market associations can be pressured, the legal ambiguities around land tenure and residency rights for Igbo living outside the Southeast can be exploited at any moment. And this is where the architecture reveals itself most clearly. The Igbo have been permitted, even encouraged, to integrate economically into every part of Nigeria. That integration benefits everyone. Northern consumers, Western traders, Middle Belt suppliers, they all depend on Igbo commercial networks. But the political rights that would make that economic presence permanent, secure, and politically powerful, the right to own land with full title in states across Nigeria, the right to vote as a bloc in the state where you have lived and built for generations, those rights have been systematically withheld. The economic integration has been permitted, the political integration has been architecturally blocked. The result is a community whose prosperity depends on Nigeria's stability more than any other groups does, because they have no regional fortress to retreat to. They have invested their wealth inside Nigeria as a whole, and that total exposure is being used quietly as a form of political leverage against them. Here is what this means for the country, not just for the Igbo, but for every Nigerian in every zone. Nigeria's federal system exists on a theory that the diversity of its constituent groups will be represented in its institutions, that no single group will dominate the apex of governance permanently, that federal character will produce a state that all citizens feel they have a stake in. That theory has always been imperfectly realized, but the complete categorical exclusion of one of the three largest ethnic groups from the presidency is not an imperfection, it is a structural failure. And structural failures in federations do not stay contained, they metastasize. The rise of IPOB is the most visible symptom of that metastasis. And this is where the analysis needs to be precise, because this point is almost always misread. IPOB's secessionist position is not primarily a cultural expression of Igbo identity. It is a political conclusion drawn from evidence accumulated over decades that the Nigerian state does not intend to include the Igbo on an equitable terms. When a population exhausts the available channels for legitimate political participation and finds them systematically blocked, the rational response is to question whether participation in that system is worth continuing. IPOB did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a specific history of exclusion, and it grows every time that exclusion is reinforced. The security response to IPOB, military operations in the southeast, the designation of the organization, the crackdowns, is real and has real consequences. But security operations do not address political conclusions. You cannot arrest a grievance. And every deployment of federal military force into the southeast without a corresponding political commitment to addressing the underlying exclusion deepens the conclusion that IPOB is drawing. It does not weaken it. Now, the mechanism flagged earlier about the gap between what the Constitution promises and what happens in Southeast polling units. Let's name it precisely. The pattern, documented by multiple elections by civic observers, domestic monitors, and international election missions, is one of differential security deployment. Heavy military and police presence in Southeast polling units that functions not as voter protection but as voter suppression. Announced turnout figures that diverge from parallel civic tallies, results that contradict field-level reporting. This is not a logistical failure. It is a feature of how federal power maintains its electoral geometry, ensuring that even when the Southeast votes, its vote does not convert into the national weight its population warrants. Here is the data point that reframes the national stakes completely. Nigeria is one of only a handful of large democracies on earth where a community that ranks among the top 3 ethnic groups by population and is, by almost any measure, the most commercially integrated group in the national economy has been categorically excluded from the highest executive office since the country's founding. For context, the United States, with all of its racial history, produced a black president 233 years after independence. Nigeria is 64 years old. This is not a comparison meant to flatter the United States. Its record on racial equity is its own complex history. It is a comparison meant to establish that what is happening in Nigeria is not normal, not inevitable, and not the natural result of democratic competition. It is a structural outcome that is being produced.
Now, let's be fair, because this analysis does not serve its purpose if it refuses to take the strongest counter-arguments seriously. Here is the most credible argument made by those who defend the status quo or attribute Igbo exclusion to Igbo strategic failure. The Igbo have never built the cross-regional political alliances required to win a Nigerian presidential election. Politics is about coalition building, sustained multi-year coalition building, not just election season outreach. The Igbo political elite has been historically fragmented. Individual ambitions have repeatedly overridden collective strategy. The failure to consolidate around a single candidate, to engage party machinery years before primaries, to build durable alliances with northern and middle belt power structures, these are documented failures, and they matter. You cannot win a Nigerian presidential election by showing up at primary season with a candidate and expecting institutional structures built by others over decades to open for you. This argument deserves its full weight because it is partially true and it is insufficient. Here is why. Peter Obi did the work. The 2023 Labour Party campaign built exactly the kind of cross-regional, cross-ethnic, multi-demographic coalition that the strategic failure argument says was missing. He campaigned in the north, he won the FTT, he demonstrated urban viability across multiple regions. The coalition was real, measurable, and documented. If the standard for Igbo presidential viability is build a genuine national coalition, and someone builds one and still does not receive a declared victory that matches the observable evidence of his support, then the strategic failure argument has been tested by the 2023 election and found incomplete. It explains the losses before 2023. It does not explain 2023. Which means something else is also operating. And the analysis of that something else is what this video has been building toward. Now, let's clear 3 misconceptions that muddy this conversation on all sides. First, that Igbo don't vote as a bloc so they cannot win. This is a false framing of what electoral viability requires. No major ethnic group in Nigeria votes as a single monolithic bloc. Not the Hausa and Fulani, not the Yoruba, not the Ijao. Electoral viability for a presidential candidate does not require bloc voting. It requires building a supermajority in your base and supplementing it with cross-regional support. That is what every winning presidential candidate has done. Obi demonstrated it was structurally possible for a Southeast candidate. The argument that Igbo non-bloc voting explains their exclusion is a way of holding the Igbo to a standard that no other group is required to meet. Second, that the Biafra War explains everything. The civil war is real. The trauma is historical. The distrust is historical. But the war ended 55 years ago. The institutional mechanisms that sustain Igbo political exclusion today, the delegate arithmetic, the party structure, the differential security deployment, the land tenure asymmetries, were designed and implemented decades after the gun scienced. They are not echoes of 1967. They are decisions made in 1999 and 2003 and 2011 and 2023. Historical trauma does not write constitutional provisions or design party primary rules. People do, and the people who designed the current architecture made choices. Attributing those choices to the Civil War is a way of putting them beyond accountability. Third, and this is the most corrosive one, that an Igbo president would govern for Igbo interests and not for Nigeria as a whole.
This suspicion is applied to Igbo candidates in a way that is not applied to any other group. There was no equivalent national conversation about whether a Fulani president would govern only for Fulani interests. There was no serious mainstream debate about whether a Yoruba presidency would privilege Yoruba economic interests above national ones. The selective application of this suspicion to the Igbo is not a neutral political concern. It is a bias that operates as a gatekeeping mechanism, and the evidence against it is the entire history of Igbo economic behavior. A community whose traders, manufacturers, and businessmen are embedded in the economies of every northern and western state have pan-Nigerian interests by definition. Their prosperity depends on Nigeria's stability everywhere, not just in the southeast. They are, in practice, the most invested stakeholders in the success of Nigeria as a whole. The suspicion that they would govern tribally is the exact inverse of what their economic behavior demonstrates.
If what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Let's look at what happens next, because the strategic picture for the coming years is specific and consequential. There are 3 moves being made right now by the key players in this story, and Nigerians need to know what to watch for. The first is the Tinubu administration's management strategy towards the southeast. Do not expect confrontation, expect management. The playbook is selective patronage, ministerial appointments that are prominent in title and profile, infrastructure announcements designed to generate goodwill, security negotiations meant to reduce the political temperature in the region ahead of electoral season. The question to ask about every high-profile Igbo appointment in this administration is precise. Does this person control a budget line that matters? Do they have decision-making power over resources, contracts, or policy? Or are they placed in positions of visibility without institutional leverage? Visibility without leverage is management, not inclusion. Watch the difference carefully. The second move is inside the Labour Party and the Obi political coalition. The 2023 result created something that did not exist before: a documented, measurable, cross-regional coalition of Nigerians willing to vote for a Southeast candidate. That coalition either consolidates into a durable structural opposition with real state-level roots, governorship wins, senatorial presence, local government networks built over the next 2 to 3 years, or it dissolves. Individual political calculations will pull people back towards APC and PDP, where the patronage is and the jobs are. The signal to watch is simple. Does Labour Party win any governorship outside the Southeast in the next state election cycle? One governorship win outside the Southeast proves the structure is building. Failure to win any signals the coalition is dissolving back into the old architecture. The third move is happening inside the Southeast itself, and it is the least visible but potentially the most consequential. There is a sharpening contest between 2 political factions. One faction believes the path to the presidency runs through alignment with the existing system, engaging APC or PDP on their terms, accepting the role of junior coalition partner, working within the delegate architecture even though that architecture was not built for them. The other faction believes that path has been permanently gamed, that no amount of playing by the existing rules will produce a different result, and that the only real leverage is building independent political power from the ground up, state by state, council by council, institution by institution. Every external power broker, every governor, every federal minister, every political financer is working to ensure that this internal contest produces fragmentation rather than unity. Because a fragmented Southeast is manageable, a unified one is not. If escalation happens and the conditions for it are present, it looks like this:
continued security crackdowns in the southeast, further cycles of IPOB-related violence and federal response, a 2027 election in which southeast turnout is again suppressed and results are again disputed, and a generation that concludes on the basis of accumulated lived experience that electoral participation is permanently futile. That conclusion, once it becomes generational, does not reverse easily. The political consequences of a Southeast that has given up on electoral politics would not stay in the Southeast. They would change the security and political calculus of the entire federation. De-escalation requires something that has never been seriously attempted: a concrete, formal, multi-party zoning agreement. Not a gentleman's understanding, not a rhetorical commitment at a rally, but a documented political compact backed by structural guarantees committing the major parties to supporting a Southeast candidacy in 2027. Whether that kind of agreement is possible depends entirely on whether Nigeria's political class has made an honest calculation about what continued exclusion costs and compared it honestly to what sharing the presidency costs. The evidence of the last 64 years suggests that calculation has not been made honestly. The question for the next 2 years is whether 2023 changed the terms enough to force it.
So let's return to where we started. The Igbo are commercially powerful enough to have rebuilt an entire regional economy from 20 pounds and post-war ruins. They are present in every state in this federation. They are in the most practical sense the most pan-Nigerian ethnic group in the country because their prosperity is bound up with Nigeria's stability everywhere, not just at home. They have demonstrated in 2023 that a cross-regional presidential coalition around a Southeast candidate can be built and can be real. And in 64 years, not one Igbo person has held the presidency. Is that exclusion a wound from the past? The Civil War happened. The trauma is real. The distrust was genuine. These are facts. But wounds heal. Wounds that are left to heal without being reopened become scars. Visible, historical, no longer bleeding. What we have documented in this analysis is not a scar, it is a wound that is being kept open. The 1999 transition architecture that excluded the Southeast from the negotiating table, that was a choice. The party delegate system that structurally disadvantages a 5-state zone against a 19-state bloc, that was a design. The differential security deployment in Southeast polling units, that is a policy implemented election after election by institutions that answer to federal power. The land tenure asymmetries that prevent Igbo citizens from converting their economic presence in northern states into political presence in those states, those are laws maintained by legislators who benefit from the status quo they sustain. None of these are echoes of 1967. They are decisions made by living people in living institutions in the present tense. A wound kept open is not a wound anymore. It is a choice. For the comment section, one question, and I want your honest answer. If a formal, binding, multi-party zoning agreement were offered tomorrow, committing to a Southeast presidency in 2027, what would the Igbo political elite have to give up to secure it? And would they be willing to pay that price? If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.